Hello, good evening, it's nice to be back. Thanks, Hashbury, who's just said hello and welcome back. Yeah, I think it was almost a month since we did our last show. So hello to everyone who's watching us on Twitter, normal channels, Twitter, on YouTube, Facebook, and also on TikTok. Hopefully, we can get to blue sky soon. That would be nice. The first thing I'd like to do is welcome my co-host, Karen Van Sweden. Hello, Karen. How are you doing?
I'm good, yes, and I read your article today in today's National. I'd recommend that to the people watching and listening to us, and that points out the very clear blue water between what the Scottish Government is doing currently with the fiscal powers that it has, and what the British Government is doing with the monetary and fiscal powers that it has. And of course, we would like to see the Scottish Government have both those powers. That would be ideal going forward. So yeah, I'd recommend that to the people that are watching. If you haven't,
yeah, it was nice to see the article in the National today. I think we'll do a little bit more because I got independently. I got some quite good feedback as well that people were kind of surprised at how much the Scottish Government was mitigating, and we also had a really good comment from Professor Danny Dorling, who's speaking for us at the festival in March, and he was saying, kind of in other words, he was saying, how can Scotland do this and the UK can't? And it was kind of like, puzzle me this, or I always kind of thought, like, make it make sense. So I think we should do a little bit more on this, because it's almost £1.5 billion that the Scottish Government effectively tops up on the block grant that comes back from Westminster, and we decide to do something very different from it. And as I say in the article, yeah, there's real clear blue water between what Scottish Government doing and what Westminster, Tory or Conservative, Tory or Labour. I tried to explain a little bit of context for that. But yeah, thanks for reading it, Kieran, and for mentioning it. Charles Williams Anglican National today was excellent. So yeah, thanks very much, Charles, for reading that. Okay, well, we've got a slightly different topic tonight, and we're going to look at crisis. And when I bought this book earlier, just over summer, actually.
Raise it up. Yes.
You got it? Yeah, there you go. It's called Against the Crisis, and not the Against Crisis, which I called it when we were doing our interview with Ståle, but I did edit that out and recorded it again. Against the Crisis. But yeah, it was really interesting, because it talks about what actually is a crisis. What type of event is a crisis? What leads it on? What changes does it have in the reaction? The reaction when you understand if it's a crisis or not. Is there such thing as a polycrisis? What's a pseudo crisis? We've got a 45-minute interview. We covered a lot, didn't we, Kieran?
Yeah. It was a really interesting man, and really some different interesting perspectives, and really made me think about the use of the fight, the crisis that we're always talking about just now, which is the cost of living crisis. And really, is it really, or really, is this something that is coming about through so many multiple ways? But anyway, we should go to the interview.
Yeah. I think honestly, it's a brilliant interview. We kind of went through lots of topics. It's only 45 minutes. I think you'll really enjoy it. We're really grateful for Ståle doing the interview for us. Enjoy it. Please drop your thoughts and comments into the chat as always. Enjoy the interview, and we'll see you back here in about 45 minutes. Ståle Holgersen, thank you for joining us to discuss your book, Against the Crisis, Economy and Ecology in a Burning World. Now, our dysfunctional economy and the ecological crisis are two of the main themes for our podcast, and so we're really delighted that we're interviewing you. I'm sure our listeners and our viewers will get loads from you. Well, congratulations on the book. It's a great deep dive into the ecological crisis, and I think a crisis of capitalism. Now, it's got a much wider scope than just the connection between a capitalist economy and our failing ecosystems. It covers the theoretical underpinning of crisis and the central role of capitalism in those crises. I think it's also a useful companion when trying to analyse many of the other significant crises we've faced in the last 100 years, including financial crisis and pandemic. So it's absolutely packed. I'd love to know a little bit more about you.
Please do tell us about your background and what you're busy with now.
Yeah, so I'm Norwegian, somehow I ended up in Sweden. I did my undergraduate in Bergen in Norway, studying human geography. Urban questions, urban Marxism, urban development, urban planning. Then working a bit as planner in a municipality a few years before going to Sweden to do a PhD. And yeah, of course, the plan was never to stay in Sweden, only to get there 4 years and then go back home. But then, what happened? It was the one thing that should not happen. I found a partner, and I'm here with kids and job and a house, and So I live in Sweden, and I'm working on at Stockholm University as a senior lecturer. I've been doing mostly urban development, urban planning previously before coming to this book, where I put that aside and just worked on crisis. So previously more urban crisis, but then I took away the urban and just let the crisis bloom. And what I'm working on now is more on climate change, oil politics, particularly in Norway, interviewing oil workers in Norway about their relation to oil, climate, and development.
Could you tell us what your PhD was in, Ståle?
Yeah, in human geography on Malmö and the city of Malmö, the history of Malmö, and economic development and urban development in relation to economic crisis.
Okay, that's
so how the crisis in the 70s and 2008 impacted the urban development in Malmö.
So I'd like to start with some definitions. I think understanding what we would class as a crisis is really important. So what's your definition of a crisis? And could you also cover a pseudo-crisis as well?
Yeah, so I think this is, I hope, one of the main contributions with the book. Today, the concept of crisis is absolutely everywhere, which I think is a problem, analytically and politically. Analytically, we cannot continue screaming around crisis and everything happening without knowing what we're talking about. So I suggest the definition, which people might disagree on, but at least then we can disagree. So my definition builds on the work of Daniel Ben-Said and Bob Jessop and others who. So, for example, Bob Jessop said that crisis is about symptomatology. There's some symptoms of some underlying things. And Daniel Ben-Said says that a crisis is a paroxysm. It's a sudden outbreak of a known disease. So I build on that and say that crisis under capitalism are social paroxysms, which means, and has my definition, some kind of turning point necessarily building on three components. One, it's some kind of event happening relatively fast. This event is rooted in some kind of underlying structure or process. And three, this must have negative consequences for humans or nature, or at least someone. Without the first one, we can have all kind of permanent problems. Without the second one, we can have all kind of things happen by chance. And without the third one, we can, hypothetically have something that's good for everyone. Okay. And this is my definition, and it's quite broad because it needs to be broad because crises are different, but also comes with certain limits. So everything is not a crisis. Crises are never permanent, and they do not come out of thin air or out of life, nothing. Yeah. So that's kind of my definition of crisis, and people might disagree on that, and that's fine. I prefer disagreement to confusion, because without any definition, we can only have confusion. We cannot actually speak together. So rather to have definitions on the table that we can disagree upon than just speaking about not having any idea what the other person mean when they say a crisis. So a pseudo-crisis then would be a crisis having the same something looking like a crisis, which is not rooted in underlying processes. Okay. So it might be that this concept come from Naomi Klein's in her shock doctrine.
Yes, I know it.
And she don't have the same definition of crisis as I do, but I think it's a very good concept, seeing that somebody can try to impose a situation that very much looks like crisis, that might be felt for people like it is a crisis, but it's not really rooted in underlying structure and processes, which then fall out of the definition of crisis. Might be as important, but it's not a real crisis in the same sense.
Okay, and do you use the term polycrisis?
No, I don't. I think that's that concept has a few problems.
Okay.
Politically and analytically. Analytically, I think in crisis talk in general, there are two problems. It comes without a definition, and it's impossible to say how crises actually are related. I think polycrisis, the concept and discussion around it, reproduce both those problems.
Okay. Yes.
First, it comes without any definition of crisis. It can be used for anything, from
Yeah.
war to terror to IT problems to actual economic crisis or climate change or whatever, and everything in between. All kind of problems are just called crisis. And in terms of relations, the way they are seen is often like one crisis impacting something, or one thing impacting something else. So we're always talking about how they're related on a surface level, never deeper down. Okay. So that's why I have analytical problems with the concept. Politically, I think it's very interesting that the concept is booming in the 2020s.
Okay.
It's very different from 2010s,
Okay.
where we had an elite, we have some ruling class and leading politicians desperately trying to avoid any talk or any kind of crisis. The whole economy was going to be run in 2010s as if 2008 didn't happen. We're just going to like restore neoliberalism one way or the other.
Yeah.
There's not going to be a crisis.
Yeah.
But that did not work.
Yeah.
Politicians cannot rule the economy in that kind of way, even though they might wish to. So in the 2020s, we see discursive shifts, which is extremely, very, very like rough or very hard, very distinct towards, in contrast to 2010s. Now the ruling class speaks about crisis everywhere.
Yeah.
And if you think that the crisis is good for the left, this might be like a good sign. I don't. I don't at all. I think this is the way of the ruling class acknowledging neoliberalism is dead. Something needs to change. We don't know how, but we're going to use this crisis to our advantage.
So, you know, currently at the moment, especially in the UK, it's the cost of living crisis that is quoted all the time. What do you think about the use of that term?
Again, analytically, I think it's problematic. Politically, I don't know. So analytically, of course, what we're talking about is, or at least was into 2022 when the term exploded, was inflation, where the those that needed to pay was like the lowest part of the working class. Like so often happening in economic crisis. So of course, if that was related to an economic crisis, it's a sub-crisis, it's a subcategory of an economic crisis. Fine.
Okay.
But then again, what we're actually talking about very often is just poverty, right? People being poor.
Yeah.
And crises are something coming and going. And I think there's a problem here. If we think it's a crisis, we indicate somehow that it will go away. But poverty under capitalism is not necessarily something going away. It might be more or less of it in terms of how things develop, but as a thing, it exists in capitalism, and there's no reason to assume that poverty in UK will go away in like 10 or 5 or 10 years. So in that sense, it's problematic to call it a crisis, indicating this will soon pass.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good example of how useful the book was in highlighting that, because there's so much discussion in the UK around this cost of living crisis, and you hear people saying things like, well, no, actually it's a poverty crisis or it's a crisis of capitalism, but they're still using this word crisis, which indicates that at some point there's no event that led to this cost of living crisis. It's the underlying structure of how we're constructing our society, and that's not a crisis. This is something that we have to address very differently from how you would address a crisis. Well, I think that kind of that overall schism that you've given us in the book is really useful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and so the book is about crisis, but one of my messages is speak less about crisis. It's no reason to speak more about crisis than we need to. Rather opposite, very often. Yeah.
So much of the book is kind of underpinned by a Marxist approach to crisis. Would you like to kind of explain briefly what that is and how useful that was for you when you were looking at the crisis or the problems or the situation that we have at the moment?
Yeah, I think a Marxist understanding is absolutely crucial to understand the broader dynamics, the underlying reasons for both economic and ecological crisis. I think that's the main benefit from Marxism, is to understand the core of the system and the real reasons behind crisis. The big challenge then is, okay, Marxists have this massive knowledge about how the system works. But there's two, so for Marx, it's obvious, or Marx was clear that speaking about economic crisis, they comes from contradictions within capitalism. And same we can say with ecological crisis today as well. Two problems then. One, which contradictions? Two, how do we use these contradictions in politics? So first one, of course, speaking about economic crisis, in Marx you can find like straightforward arguments for overproduction, underconsumption, disproportionality, and not least, of course, falling out of profit argument. And that's different ways of reading Marx, which can lead you in different directions. Speaking on this level, I'm very inspired by Ernst Mandel, the Belgian Marxist, who insists on saying that we need to start the analysis from including all these kind of different perspectives. So very often in Marxism, you have this division or this divide between those focused on the production side of things, going into the falling out of profit argument, and those focusing on realization and circulation, which is more on this overproduction side. And following Mandel, we just need to insist that both of these are very crucial. And from starting point, we need to say that both are very important. So the second argument then, or second maybe the problem then, is that, okay, we have this general insights in these dynamics and contradictions and how capitalism works. Does that help us when a crisis hits? When people lose jobs, when people lose homes, they need solutions to crisis, which is very hands-on. And what Marxists are good at is this abstract like theory, which is very hard to directly make into politics. And this is the reason why so many Marxists run directly to Keynes when there is a crisis, because Marxists have not really developed some kind of crisis management of their own. And this is not an easy task to do. But hopefully my book is also a little step in that direction, trying to insist that we also need some kind of socialist crisis management and not only running to Keynes every time.
My kind of summary was that, in essence, the Marxist view that comes across from this is that all crises are class crisis. And you know, there's a quote, and I think it's I'll just find my notes. Bill McKibben, and you say, and this is in the book, the climate crisis is first and foremost killing those who have done the least to cause it. And you also say that this is very similar. With the same pattern is also found in economic crisis. This is a quote from the book. Those with the least power to shape and make decisions about the economy are hardest hit time after time. So are all crises class crisis?
Yes. And it's almost followed by definition as the capitalist economy is a class economy. It would be very strange if the crises then who are part of this economy will not also have a class character, both in terms of where they come from. Of course, if the crises come out of capital accumulation, it's somebody who's doing this capital accumulation. Capital accumulation is not happening by itself. It's not only abstractions we're talking about here. We're talking about actual people doing actual investments that on an aggregate level leads to this crisis. And also in terms of outcome and how they're handled. Always class character in terms of crisis management and crisis politics.
So who else do you think has given us a good grounding of what a crisis really is? And Hyman Minsky is mentioned a few times in the book. Can you give us your reading of Minsky and his financial instability hypothesis and any other foundational work to build on?
Yeah, so I build on the main building block here is Marx and Marxists, and Mandel was mentioned, and Ben Said and others. But that doesn't mean that we should not also speak about Keynesians and Minsky and others, of course, and Schumpeter not least. Concerning Minsky, I don't go into depth on Minsky, but he cannot and should not be avoided in a book about crisis.
It was really nice to see Minsky in a book, that has got that Marxist underpinning. So this is why we wanted to kind of push you on this, because we have done a few things on Minsky.
Yeah, no, so for Minsky, so the way the Minsky moment is most often understood is that when the economy is doing good, there will be more investments, and because of competitions, firms will be forced to invest more and take up more debt in order to invest more. And as this continues, more and more debt will be accumulated, and there will be overinvestment. And this, when the Minsky moment kind of hits, they will turn. Mm-hmm. And when it turns, it's all about selling these investments and selling your assets. And that's why also it's often said that in the economic crisis or financial crisis, there are two things that are very important. One is not to panic, and the other is to panic before everyone else. And then it goes down, and it's all about selling your assets or getting out of it. And this is kind of the classic, very easy put forward, the Minsky kind of moment, and it's very often associated with euphoria, or like this, this kind of the Keynesian way of reading it, at least, is more related to the psychological part of getting into this hype of things going up. And for Marxists, this has been problematic because we insist that it's all about underlying structures in the system. It's not about feelings and emotions, psychology, hysteria, etc. And I think this is not an either or. I think especially in financial crisis, the hysteria part of it is there. It should be acknowledged, but it must be placed in the right, placed correctly in the broader system or in the broader crisis. So of course, this discussion about hysteria and euphoria and that way of thinking about crisis have been quite central since Tulipan crisis in Amsterdam in 1630, and it's still there in 2008, and it's still there when financial crisis happen for a reason. Yeah, and we can place that within the political economic system, which is called capitalism. Why do we have a system that sometimes, or today, so much make these kind of things happen? But also sometimes in capitalism, these things do not happen that often, like in the post-war decades, didn't happen that often, etc. But when it happens, it's crucial. And I try to understand this on different levels of abstraction. And this is not on the underlying level, it's more on in immediate level, which is also important to understand the crisis. Yeah. So I was trying to make a Marxist framework, which not only is about underlying, but acknowledge the underlying stuff being very important, but also acknowledge the crisis as a crisis and intermediate levels. Yeah.
I thought the levels of abstraction that you look at in the book was fascinating, and I was thinking about covering that, but I think that's my range. If you really want to understand the depth and the level and the analytical tools that you've given us, then you really need to read the book, because that's pretty in depth. And I thought, I spent a day just reading and reading over that section because there was so much in it. So the how you broke that down into those 5 levels, I think, was fascinating. But my final point on Minsky was, I always looked at Minsky as a Marxist, because he said there's fundamentally something wrong with capitalism, and it's displayed through the financial sector. It will always, the crises will always develop. They're unavoidable, and I thought that was a real connection to Marx. One of the other elements, really strong point that I got from the book was this idea, which I couldn't believe I hadn't really thought about before until you wrote it in the book, and it's that you said that ecological and economical crises, they rarely become, or really quickly become, political crisis. So you've got all these ecological, these economic crises, but they rarely transfer into the political sphere. And I just wondered if you could kind of explain how you came up with that and what the reasons for that were. I know that could be a whole episode in itself, so just scratch the surface of that one.
Yeah, there is a lot to say about that. But just to follow up on your question, because it is a mystery, right? That the climate crisis, acknowledged by so many leading politicians, is the greatest challenge, greatest crisis of our time. Nobody seems to, under the last 20 years, nobody has been able to solve it. Why hasn't all these politicians who didn't solve the greatest crisis, why are they sacked? Why isn't this the massive legitimation crisis for the political system, for the economy and everything? So there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of things to discuss, of course. I think one main reason is the role of the state under capitalism, under liberal capitalism at least, which has some kind of relative autonomy between economic and political spheres. I think this is quite important to understand how these crises do not necessarily cause political crisis. So, for example, if we take contrast to Soviet Union, which did not have this relative autonomy between the spheres, at least in theory or in rhetorics, the economy was democratic, so that if anything happened within the economy, people could look at the politicians and say, fix it. Mm-hmm. The politicians are supposed to rule the economy, so fix the economic system for us, which they couldn't, which led to a legitimation crisis in that system. Under this was quite superficial, but I hope you get the main point. In the capitalism or liberal capitalism is very different, as there is this relative autonomy between the political spheres and economic spheres, both rhetorically and actually existing. When there's, for example, an economic crisis, politicians can say it was not us who caused it, and it's correct. It doesn't really matter often if it's a social democrat or conservative running the state. The crisis will happen anyhow, independently of what some kind of, or relatively independent of what some kind of politicians do. And even that, after the crisis hit, the politicians step forward and say, it was not we who caused it, but now we're going to solve it. We will save the nation throughout this crisis management. Can turn out both ways. It can turn out that they just make it worse, or it can turn out that the fact that they actually manage to solve the economy and move forward. So there is this relative autonomy that's very important to understand how politicians can get away, maybe the wrong word, but explain why it doesn't lead to legitimation crisis.
In some kind of well-functioning, reason-based society, the climate crisis would obviously have developed into a giant crisis of legitimacy. So we've obviously, this week, we have seen a more wealthy section of society lose their homes in the Palisades in California. It's devastation. It looks like Gaza there, because these houses are burned down. I am very sure, full disclosure here, I'm a city councillor, that the city councillors are very much having a crisis right now in California, because they are the people who will have to directly deal with this issue. So it will be a crisis for them. The problem for them, of course, is the people right at the top who are in charge of printing the money. They might not consider it a crisis, and we're deeply concerned about that with Trump coming into office. So the question here is, what about bodies like who are supposed to be independent, like central banks? So, for example, you have the central bank in Sweden, the Bank of England in the UK, and the Federal Reserve. Do you think that they're responding to the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think they will. This is maybe a little bit straightforward, but I think they will take it into account when they need to in terms of the economy. I think that's the short answer. The main function of central banks is to save the capitalist economy. And they will stop climate change, or they will change their ways of investing or steering the money when that serves the economy. I think that's the short answer for that one, which is very depressing, because so far that has led us into on the path to climate catastrophe, and it might continue to do so. But that would be my short answer to that one. And I don't think we should in any way hope for or have any optimism or hopes on that these individuals running the central banks will or any other banks will be the progressive parts in the transformation, unless they are forced to by someone else.
But we spoke about the connection between ecological and economic crisis and the kind of political arena, but we also cover a little bit in the book. So what crisis leads to fascism? And can you summarize your thoughts on that? Because I think, you know, when I was reading this, I tied this to the work of Clara Matti, who spoke about the new capital order and the link to capitalism. And I was really keen to get your thoughts on that connection between crisis and an eventual leap to fascism.
First on Clara Matti, which I read after reading this book. So I don't discuss her in the book, but I read it afterwards. And I love that book. It was very good. She uses the concept of crisis differently than me. I'm not sure if you noticed it, if you read both books. For her, crisis, as I read it, maybe I read it wrong, poorly. Her definition of crisis is the end of capitalism, or the capitalism falling. That's kind of the capitalism being a problem is the crisis. And then austerity is some kind of what happens in 2021 when they solve this crisis. In my vocabulary, it's the other way around. It's what happening in the 1918 and 19. It's not end of capitalism. It's not the crisis. It's the attempts for revolution. Mm-hmm. That's what's happening. And what's happening in 2021 is not necessarily austerity. It's the crisis. Mm-hmm. So I would say that what solves the problems in capitalism with socialist movements is at this time maybe the economic crisis in 2021. Okay, but in general on fascism, so I built on, for example, Nikos Belantzas and a lot of others, saying that fascism is not for ordinary times. Fascism is when the economy is doing poorly and the ruling class needs some extraordinary ways of reestablishing the order. Mm-hmm. And of course, Belantzas look at history of Italy and Germany and how it developed into fascism and Nazism, and look at economic crisis, mm-hmm. Ideological crisis, political crisis, social crisis, etc. Legitimation crisis. And here I think it talks about organic crisis when you see more crises coming together, which is a better term than polycrisis, just to go back to that one, and a crisis of hegemony, when the hegemonic crisis, when the old ruling order needs to be replaced. And there's two things to say about that. First thing is, I think this is a very good insight. And so one of my arguments in the book is that capitalism is reproduced through crisis. And fascism then becomes, the solution when it looks like my hypothesis is failing. Mm-hmm. When it looks like my book is wrong, fascism is always there to make my conclusion correct, unfortunately. The second thing is, what about the climate crisis then? Of course, Belantzas did not talk about that in the 70s. Today we must and can. And this is also discussed, of course, at length in White Skin, Black Fuel by Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective. Could the climate crisis be one of those crises leading to fascism? And again, unfortunately, I think there are different ways of saying, or different reasons to say yes, it might. Doesn't have to, but it might. Which we need to, be careful or know about and maybe even prepare for. So one is that classical fascism as a reaction to progressive movements. What would happen if we get politicians that actually said we're going to stop at 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, and we're going to do whatever it takes to stop at 2 degrees, even if it means like nationalizing or banks, or nationalizing industries and shutting down a large part of the economy? How would fossil fuel react to that, and what will relation between fossil fuel companies and the far right do in becoming such a moment? Would it be a reactionary, fascist, response to that? Yes, I think it would. The other would be if climate change come with more ecological crisis in terms of all kind of wildfires and storms, or all kind of shocks that hits the economy, hits the societies. We know that these kind of shocks, as we know from the shock doctrine of Naomi Klein and from my book, will always be opportunities for those with power to do what they want.
Yeah.
That could go in the wrong direction, absolutely. Third one, what if the far right suddenly says, okay, climate change is real. It is caused by humans. But what humans? Who to blame? As Marxists, we say it's because of the capitalist class or leading politicians. The far right will never blame the capitalist class or leading anybody with power or the elites in the global north. Somebody else needs to be blamed. Might be the Jews, might be Muslims, might be Chinese, might be people in Africa or India or overpopulation or wherever. But that might also be very ugly and with extreme degrees of racism, and might also be one path towards some kind of fascism. So yeah, it's good reason to be a little bit afraid about or worried about the role of fascism in a warming world.
You write that most shocks simply enable the establishment to further secure its position. And I quote from the book here, capitalist crises reproduce capitalism. You said that earlier. In other words, shocks are good for the 1% and terrible for everyone else. And you found very little evidence that crises lead to meaningful or progressive change. Is that a fair reflection of what you wanted to come across the book? And can you give me some hope as well, please, Ståle, if at all, if you're able to do that?
So when I started writing the book, the working title was Optimism at the Edge of a Cliff. That was a working title for a long time. And the more I got into these two crises, and I wrote a book during the pandemic, 2020, 2021, so also time to get a little bit depressed. So the less optimistic I got every day working with the crisis, especially understanding class character of the crisis and who normally benefits from them. And you can find all kind of data as well on, yes, there are more demonstration after an economic crisis, but voters tend to go to the far right after an economic crisis. So you can find all this kind of data. The working class loses in all kind of ways after a crisis. And so my optimism kind of disappeared step by step working with the crisis. And it ended up being the title for the epilogue, because I insist on optimism nonetheless. But I don't think the optimism can be found in the crisis themselves. They must be found in society despite the crisis. So, and where do we find optimism? Where do I find optimism or hope? Human beings, humans. We are humans. We can do better than this. That's my true belief, and I truly believe that we can change the system, and that's where my optimism comes from. And so yeah, optimism, yes, but despite the crisis, not because of the crisis. I will also say that the main conclusion then is that there is a tendency that the ruling class benefits from crisis. This is not an iron law; it's a tendency. And there's a reason for this tendency, as I show in the book, but it's also our historical missions as human beings, socialists in the 2020s, to make an historical exception from this rule. We need to win the next crisis. We need to start winning the crisis, which means confronting and winning over capitalism somehow as well. And I also bring in optimism into that struggle as well.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for that little bit of sunshine there.
Ståle, do you think that some crises can be avoided? I'm thinking of the COVID pandemic as an example. Is capitalism flexible?
Yeah, I think we understand like this, that capitalism will always be dependent on crisis. It's in the very system it's in the very system that it need to produce crisis, economic and ecological ones. That will never change. But how this happens can vary very much, can be very flexible and change very much. So something like the COVID-19 could be avoided. That didn't need to happen. There will necessarily be more pandemics, but not necessarily that one. And in terms of economic crisis, there will be comparing the post-war decades to neoliberalism is very different decades we're talking about. One having a large amount of economic crisis and financial crisis and all around the world. The other one hardly having anyone. Mm-hmm. So we must understand that this is very different. It can come in very different forms. It's very easy to be colored by the latest event, the latest crisis, the latest decades, or the latest 100 years. And I think, but we need to be, if we look at the broader picture, we need to be quite flexible here. For example, just one example, that Karl Marx, when he started writing in his youth, he was very colored by the 18th century, where crisis was some kind of associated revolutions with the fall of capitalism. So in the young Marx, we see this optimism to crisis, that the next crisis will lead to revolution. When Marx got older, when he lived through the decades of the the 1840s, the 1850s, and 1860s. His change on this changed very dramatically. His view on this changed dramatically, and he started to see crisis as some kind of creative destruction rather than some pathway to socialism. So he was colored by the 18th century. I think we today are very colored by the 20th century. And this is his challenge, especially in terms of economic crisis. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many of us has been waiting for we were speaking about interregnum after 2008, because we were waiting for a sharp shift between neoliberalism and something else. I think this was very colored by the fact that Fordism came and went through very distinct and fast periods defined by crisis. So the Great Depression and the 1970s kind of moments where Fordism was turned on and off, fairly easy to see where it starts and ends. And we are colored by that when we're waiting for something else to replace neoliberalism. But maybe we should stop thinking with the 20th century and be more flexible about the fact that the way the crisis in 2008 and 2020 plays out, maybe a little bit different. Maybe what comes after neoliberalism doesn't have to be that different from neoliberalism, that as Fordism was to laissez-faire and neoliberalism was to Fordism, for example. Yeah. So, just reflections on trying to learn from history and trying to not learn from history.
The environmental crisis, of course, there's a huge amount of variables, but I want to focus back onto the ecological crisis again, which is an exponentially larger number of variables as well. So first, I have to ask, do you classify this as a crisis? And for what reasons, what are the reasons, challenges and solutions to this crisis that you think about?
Yeah, so with my definition of crisis, there was three components. One being that's an event, and second, rooted underlying structures, three having negative consequences. For a pandemic, I think it's straightforward as one kind of subcategory of ecological crisis. For climate change, not that obvious, as it needs to be an event coming relatively quickly. And there was something I was struggling with writing the book, and suddenly I just out-defined climate change as a crisis. But two reasons to say it is a crisis. First, of course, climate change is happening very, very fast if we look at from the perspective of the climate. From the perspective of climate, it's just happening much faster than any financial crisis. Counter-argument there is that we don't live in the ecological time, we live at capitalist time. So for us, it seems to be happening fairly slower in terms of decades and not in terms of seconds. But having said that, the climate change as a crisis happens through events, or they kill people. That crisis kill people through events. So if climate change or global warming was only a slowly increase in temperature without these events, you could have a fair definition or fair discussion: is this actually a crisis according to my definition? But that doesn't happen. It comes as shocks, as we see in LA now, with wildfires, with heat waves, with storms. The climate change come with shocks, and these shocks are ecological crisis. And these shocks will escalate, and of course, we can only speak about what will happen after certain tipping points have changed and all that. So in that sense, yes, ecological crisis is a crisis. And the hardest one to reply on. It's easy as a Marxist to just go with the most general answer, because it is true that the underlying cause there goes to the heart of capitalist system. And as I mentioned, with economic crisis, they're having the same core, but with the economic crisis, you can solve the crisis and the system will reproduce itself. With ecological crisis, if you just solve the ecological crisis, the system will not go on. That's kind of the main challenge here. So the problem goes to the core of the capitalist system, and we need to confront that. So we cannot confront that with only sitting on seminars and speaking about how bad capitalism is. We also need to have concrete reforms. And concrete reforms do not necessarily challenge the heart of capitalism every time. So it also means prioritizing certain sections of capital in front of others. So that, I think, for us socialists, it means working on two fronts. with one strategy, trying to figure out which kind of progressive reforms and non-reforms reforms, if you want, can be implied today, actually meaning something in the economy, which might lead us in a certain direction.
Well, my final question for you, I'm looking for someone to support this idea because no one supports me at the moment, right? But a few weeks after reading the book, and I gave it some time, I think, for the key messages to sink in, I came to the conclusion that the Trump administration, or maybe the kind of Republican administration after this one, would volte-face on the climate crisis. So this seemed to me to be like a logical step, but I haven't found anyone who agrees with me, right? So it's such a big crisis, you can't avoid it, that at some point the Trump administration will say, yeah, there is a crisis, we need to solve it, and this is how we'll solve it. So I'm suggesting that maybe in 3 or 4 years, the Trump administration will be heavily talking about how bad the climate crisis is and how we need to solve it. What's your thoughts, Ståle? You support me on that one?
Yeah. I'm open for it. I'm absolutely open for it. Might happen. It might not happen, but also might happen. Seriously, I think, and it depends on their geopolitical situation, what capital wants at a certain point. And I think, of course, the Trump-Musk alliance is electric vehicle cars meeting climate denialism. So I think we need to be. I think we need to understand them as flexible as they are, to meet their to the needs for profits and power, and to get profits and power. We have seen historically, the ruling class and leading politicians are very flexible. Always been and always will be. And I think especially with someone like Trump and Musk, flexibility is something we need to like adapt to, so to speak. So that might happen. It might not happen, but it might happen. I don't think it might happen independently of their policy on fossil fuel. I easily imagine this might happen rhetorically while continue like fracking in the US. That's flexibility is possible.
That's it. But with the fires that are going on at the moment, it is the even if you're the strongest believer of what Trump stands for, you're seeing these fires, and at some point you think not all of them have been set by Antifa radicals. These events in the crisis become so obvious that at some point it doesn't make sense to try and deny them. And I think, again, a key point I got from the book was you said that capitalism is just so incredibly malleable. It's happy to support the welfare state. It's happy to support genocide. It's happy to support climate change. It will support anything and able to keep continuing to have the rewards that it had. And that for me was a real strong motivation for me thinking, looking ahead, there's nothing that capitalism won't take as its own to continue the system that it's developed. So that was a big message that I took from the book that I think is really powerful when we're looking at the difficulties and the challenges we have changing structure, an economic structure, when it is incredibly malleable. That makes it really, really difficult. And so, Ståle, the last question for you then, you've said in the book, I'll quote you, when we focus on only how economic crises are created, capitalism appears brittle, fragile and weak. But when we emphasize how they are resolved, it's difficult not to be overwhelmed by how flexible and adaptable capitalism actually is. And I thought that was a wonderful view. It looks like capitalism can break, but what happens? It just it redefines itself and it becomes another form of capitalism. Do you want to just give us a little bit more on your kind of rationale for seeing capitalism over the few hundred years as being a system that's been able to do that?
We have seen through history that capitalism changes a lot, and there's no reason to assume that will stop today. And I think a lot of people seems to maybe hopefully or not think that capitalism will go under with climate change or global warming. I think the opposite. I think speaking about the future, we need to be humble. We don't really know, but knowing that this system drives through or feeds on and lives through crisis and turbulence and change, that's also what we will have more and more with global warming. So if any system would thrive through global warming, it will be capitalism. It will be capitalism. So having these two things in mind and seeing them from the perspective of how the crises are produced, it looks weak. How it's reproduced and how crises are solved, it looks very flexible and strong. I think it's very important to try to look at the phenomena from both these perspectives. I think that's, I try to write in the book. It's very, of course, demanding to look from different perspectives at such a complex phenomena, but I hope I did my best. Yeah.
Well, I think you did a wonderful job of that in the book. And, we often recommend books on the show, but I really, really do recommend this. I think it was a wonderful lens to look at the ecological and the economic crisis. So, Ståle, thanks very much for writing this, and thanks so much for joining us on SCOTONOMICS.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I'm just going to bring Kieran on screen as well. Hi, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good, yes. That was a very interesting interview. I was particularly fixed on what he said about the role of fascism in a fascist world. And it brought me back to an interview that I heard with Steve Keen, I think in 2018, when his concern is that with the climate crisis becoming worse, that we'll eventually move into military rule. That's his concern. And that worries me as well. I think that is a worry. And also the other thing that he mentioned as well is we're going on as if 2008 didn't happen. And I think that's a really valid point that you brought up as well.
Yeah. And we did the interview. Was it last Friday we did the interview? So only a few days ago. And I watched it again there and got loads from it. I think those key points which we tried to highlight in the interview are still really important. But for me, as I said in the introduction, we really need to think about when we use the word crisis, because at some point a crisis has to end. And when we're looking at something like the cost of living crisis, where is the end to that? It's harder to identify and solve when you're misnaming things. I think the example which was covered in the conversation there about the wildfires in LA, a perfect example of a crisis. There is an event which is actually the fires happening. There's an underlying cause of that, which is climate change partly, but just the power of nature. And then there is the damage that it does. So I think that definition and that's something that he's given us, I think is really helpful. We had loads of comments and a few questions as well. So thank you very much for engaging. I kind of stumbled across Ståle. I'm really glad that I did. I think it was a really, really good interview. So thanks for those comments and questions. I did want to mention one thing. I'll see if I can bring it up. I don't know where this is going to come, but it's going to be on the screen somewhere. There you go. Okay, let's see if we can do that. Does that help? Can't quite see it. Let's see. In the middle there, it's the flyer for our Festival of Economics, which is in a few weeks. So I hope to look a little bit nicer than that, but it doesn't. I released that today, a good outline of what we're covering on Friday and Saturday on the 21st and 22nd of March. So please do look for some information on that, and hopefully you can join us online or in person. Lots more brilliant content. This episode is going to be available as podcast from Friday. If you do want to listen to it again, and we're also obviously keep the interview on the YouTube channel. So thanks so much for joining us. Kieran, any final comments before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I've got a really good one, actually. I was listening to the Troll podcast just before we came on, and they were talking about, with the fire in California, that there had been some big business guy, billionaire, who had tweeted out, "Firefighters, I'll pay anything. Come and help me now." As if firefighters are sitting at home and just waiting for rich people to hire them out, which is an interesting libertarian take on how a society might work for them. Which is
No, I saw that. I think, and that is a really good example. At some point, money means absolutely nothing. We're a long way away from that, but I think with the climate crisis, that certainly was likely to happen. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We're back in a couple of weeks, and we're going to have an interview around degrowth, which I think ties in quite nicely to some of the conversations we've been having this evening. So please look out for our work over the next couple of weeks. And we'll see you at the same time in a couple of weeks' time to speak about degrowth. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.